everybody. Happy Monday night. Um, we are going to talk a little bit about trauma. And I'm just going to be trying to make trauma easy to understand, I guess. Yeah, just trying to make it easy to understand. So feel free to drop your questions in the comment section. If you have any, I can try to answer them. I should be able to answer them. I am a certified clinical trauma professional. So tonight is just going to be just kind of like a brief introduction to what trauma is and how it may be affecting you. And then we'll talk maybe later about some ways that you can manage trauma, or healthier ways to cope. So, the very first question, obviously, is what is trauma, right? So, if you're watching live or even if you're catching the replay, maybe just type in the comments what you think trauma is, right? So, when you think of trauma, what is trauma to you? Okay. What is trauma? It's definitely a word that we hear a lot. I feel like now more so than ever, we hear that word trauma a lot. So when you think about that word, what does that mean to you? What is trauma? What is trauma? Let me see if I can see if there's any comments, and I'll go back and answer too. So most of the times when we think about trauma, we think about specific events, sexual abuse, physical abuse, war veterans. A lot of times when we think of like people who go off to war and then they have PTSD, that is trauma, right? And you would be right in some sense, right, that those can be traumatic events, right? But I want to give us like a different way of kind of thinking about trauma, right? Trauma doesn't necessarily have to be an event per se, but it is something that dysregulates your central nervous system. It really is a physiological and a physical response to an event and not necessarily the nature of the event, right? And here's how we know that, right? You can have a ton of people go to war, right? But not every war veteran develops PTSD. You can have two kids who grew up in the exact same household and experience the exact same things, different traumatic events, and they don't handle it the same way. They don't even perceive it the same way. They don't respond the same way. If it was just the event, then everybody who goes through that event, could possibly, respond in a traumatic way. But that's not the case. We respond differently. So it's not always necessarily the event or the nature of an event, but how the person responds to it. Okay. And we all respond very, very differently. And there's many factors that can go into this. That there could be like your genetic makeup. So just like the biology of you and kind of your chemicals and hormones and things that are going on in your brain. It could be how you were raised. That could play a part. Your support system and how much support you have could also play a part. If you have a tight-knit community and people who support you, maybe you're not as affected by some things as someone else who feels like they're alone. So there's a lot of things that can affect the way you respond to trauma. Okay, so trauma isn't necessarily an event, but it's how your body responds to the event. And we're all different, so our body responds in different ways, okay? But if your brain and your body becomes dysregulated, then that is a trauma response, right? So there is a huge biological component to this, right? And I'm gonna give you guys like a quick biology lesson, right? So the brain has three main parts, okay? So I'm kind of looking at my notes here too. The brain stem is the oldest part. It's the part that develops first, okay? So it controls messages between the brain and the rest of the body and basic body functions. So breathing, your heartbeat, right? Going to the bathroom, right? Those are basic body functions. They're automatic. You don't really have to think about them. The brain and the body sends messages to each other all the time. It does that automatically. It's the oldest part of the brain, okay? The part to develop next is the limbic region. When we think of that, think of the amygdala. That's where your emotions are. Okay. That's also like your brain's fire alarm or smoke detector. It kind of goes off when it senses trouble. So that's the amygdala. So it's responsible for that experience of emotion and the experience of memory. So, when you fall in love, right? And then something happens and then y'all not together no more. Your amygdala is responsible for those very strong emotions, and we can't stop thinking about that person. That's that part, okay? And then the next part to develop last is the cortex, and that is really involved in higher brain functioning, cognition, being able to think things through. So being able to like know that that person that you fell in love with, like that person not good for you, and you shouldn't you shouldn't get back with them, right? So your cortex, right, that's involved in concentration and those higher brain functioning would be responsible for that. That's also the part it develops last, and it's not even fully developed, I think, until about age 25. So that's why young people, make silly choices, and some older people too. So I don't, may not even have anything to do with age. But so when you're thinking about those, that biological component, right? Think about back in the day, like way back in the day when we were like cavemen, right? And so we're just kind of walking around. We don't have like fancy houses like my background here. But you're just out exposed to the open, and you come into contact with danger all the time, right? Like you run into a saber-toothed tiger and you have to figure out what you're going to do, right? That brain stem, right, that controls those basic body functions is, that's going to kick in, maybe give you like a little bit of an adrenaline boost, right? So that you can get ready to do something, right? And if you remember, like, in biology class, they called it fight, flight, or freeze, right? So you either get ready to like duke it out, or you decide, you know what, I'm not going to be able to beat this. I'm going to run. Or sometimes you completely freeze, right? And so that is, something that was developed in us. It's kind of a normal reaction, right? Now we don't have those types of dangers anymore, right? We don't run into saber-toothed tigers, but dogs, right? If you're afraid of dogs, a lot of times it's because maybe you've had some type of past experience with dogs, right? And it triggers that fight, flight, or freeze response, right? Now, here's the real kicker, right? Is that the brain does not distinguish between actual physical danger and what we call like emotional danger, right? To the brain, they're literally the same. It's going to be the same physiological and physical response. Okay, the amygdala is going to kick in. The brainstem is going to kick in. It really doesn't see a difference. If you're afraid of dogs, it might feel the exact same way when you get your heart broken. Your heart starts beating fast, or you have shallow breathing, or you start shaking. It's literally in the brain kind of like the same response. It doesn't distinguish between physical, physical fear and an emotional type of fear. And sometimes it gets kind of tricked, right? If you've been in situations, if you've been in traumatic situations where you've had a traumatic response and you remain kind of like at that high level, sometimes it'll trigger even when you're not in danger at all, right? And so that's when we have, what we call these traumatic responses to things that we don't need to have those responses to. Like the brain just kind of gets triggered. That alarm system that I talked about just kind of keeps going off. It's almost like broken in a sense when you experience some traumatic events, whether that be, something like sexual abuse or physical abuse, or chronic stress like homelessness, or experiencing or witnessing violence. It could be medical trauma. In today's world, it could be racial trauma, right? Like even shared racial trauma, things that we see on the news all the time. Like those things can elicit a traumatic response, right? So, and even if it's not chronic and it's happening all the time, even if it just happens once, you can develop a trauma response to that. So when you think of PTSD, a lot of times we think of physical symptoms like flashbacks and nightmares and responding to loud noises, right? But for a lot of people, it's not that, you know. Um, like I said, there's for some people there's just this emotional component too, where you're always at a state of arousal or your brain is always on high alert. So just kind of thinking about that, and I just kind of said a mouthful. Um, is anyone surprised, I guess, at the definition of trauma or like what trauma is? Or now you're thinking like, oh, like maybe I'm having a trauma response, to something, right? Um, Here's one of the things that was kind of life changing for me when I was kind of doing this education was that is that learning that there's nothing wrong with you when you have when you're experiencing a trauma response or if your body is on high alert, right? Like I mentioned, like, maybe like the alarm is kind of broken, but the brain is literally doing what it was created to do. And its job is to protect you, right? So like I said, when we were cavemen and you had to fight, a saber-toothed tiger and all that adrenaline rushed through your body so that you could get ready to either fight or run, that's what it was supposed to do. And so it's evolved, right? Because we don't have those type of dangers, but it's still doing what it's supposed to do. It protects us from danger, whether that danger is physical or emotional, right? It protects us. It protects us from that. So there's nothing wrong with you. Again, it's doing what it is supposed to do. It's created to do two things: adapt, right? We have to make adaptations when things happen. So that's sometimes why you'll hear when people who go through traumatic things, they kind of like space out, right? Like they don't even realize what's happening. They kind of dissociate, right? And our body was meant to adapt, and our body was meant to mitigate or kind of lessen the pain of things. And so think about like when people go into shock, right? When they get that adrenaline rush, right? I know someone, and if they watch this, they'll know that I'm talking about them, who was a long time ago was in a car accident, and car literally got like knocked to the other side of the street, and this person thought that their car was going to blow up, and so this person crawled out of their car, several feet to get away because they thought that their car was going to blow up. Now, come to find out later, how they got out of their car and crawled all that way was amazing, because he had like a broken pelvis, like a shattered pelvis, and a whole bunch of other stuff that he shouldn't have been able to do that. But because like I said, our body is made to like give us that rush of adrenaline and get ready to fight or run, it can do that. So there's nothing wrong with you when you're having these trauma responses, right? So how do these trauma responses show up emotionally for some of us, right? I'll give you an example. Like when you're repeatedly hurt by someone that you love, right? That could trigger a trauma response, right? The amygdala that's responsible for memory and emotions is going to trigger that alarm. Something is wrong. I don't feel good. This hurts, and I don't want to go through this anymore. So a trauma response could be, you know what? I don't need them. I don't need anybody. And then it just kind of generalizes, right? You start generalizing how you don't need anybody, right? And that's my trauma response. You start generalizing like, okay, well, I don't need anybody, right? And so you become really independent. That's a trauma response, because, we're supposed to be able to depend on people, or at least be able to figure out who we can depend on and who we can't. But when you've been hurt a lot, you might say, I can't trust anybody, right? And so you're in that freeze state. You kind of shut down. You kind of close off to people. So that's how trauma, just an example of a way that trauma can, affect you emotionally, right? Which is why, our childhood and our upbringing is so important, because it really does shape us, for the future. So again, it's not that it's doing anything wrong. The brain is doing what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to protect you physically and emotionally. So it comes up with ways to do that. they're not always the healthiest ways. That's where we kind of run into problems. We kind of come up with these maladaptive coping skills, and we just need to find healthier ways to cope and get regulated so that we can live our best lives. That's another cool thing about this is that you're not doomed. There's a way to learn how to deal with stress and learn how to deal with trauma, like therapy, and learn how to get your body regulated, so that you don't have as many trauma responses, or that you're not afraid to take chances. So we're gonna dig a little more into that, um, in the next couple of weeks, right? So tonight was just kind of like a brief introduction on what trauma is, kind of the biology of it, some ways that it may affect you. So if you watch this and you're kind of starting to think about that, if you don't mind sharing, maybe put in the comments some ways that trauma has affected you, either physically, physiologically, or emotionally, right? And then join me next week so that we can, chat about some ways to come up with healthier ways to cope and to deal. All right. Hope that was helpful.